God, the lovingly compassionate, the lovingly merciful. At times such as these, humanity is in desperate need of a common heritage. Places of worship and sacred sites throughout the world are just that. They are beacons of culture, spirituality, and most importantly, peace. Through cultural expression, international collaboration, and preserving traditions, their existence builds communities. They are the fruit of human creativity and spirituality, and reflect the culture and values of those who build and use them. Generally, people respect and preserve other people's cultural and spiritual sites. However, in recent years, they have become a major source of conflict and civil war. Of course, religions call upon the respect and protection of places of worship. We are extremely privileged and honored to be joined today by two distinguished and remarkable guests, Father Christopher Clohessy and Dr. Chris Hewer, who will discuss the importance of heritage sites. Let me give you a bit more background about both of our distinguished guests. Father Christopher Clohessy is a lecturer and priest at the Pontifical College for Arabic and Islamic Studies in the Vatican, Rome. Father Christopher is a South African Roman Catholic priest who holds a bachelor's in sacred theology from the Pontifical Urbania University at Rome and a PhD from the Pontifical Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies, also in Rome. He has also studied Islamic studies in Cairo and also in Rome. And he has published 3 books. One, Fatima, daughter of Prophet Muhammad. Another one about Lady Zainab called Half of My Heart. And he has recently published a 3rd book called Angels Hastening the Karbala Dreams. Dr. Chris Hewer comes from a background in Christian theology, education and Islamic studies, as well as interfaith studies, and has worked in the field of Muslims in Britain and Christian Muslim studies since 1986. First at the Center for the Study of Islam and the Christian Muslim relations at Selly in Birmingham, and also as an advisor to the interfaith relations to the Bishop of Birmingham. He has also been a fellow in Christian Muslim relations at St. Ethelberg's in London. And his current work is to teach study days and residential courses on Islam. And he has developed and written electronic resources as well. Dr. Chris Hewer has published a book called Understanding Islam, The First 10 Steps. Thank you very much to both of you for joining us. And we are incredibly inspired by both of you. So let me first start by talking to both of you about your books and about how you got involved in the study of Islam, teaching and writing about it. Father Christopher, could I begin with you, perhaps?
Thank you. So it's nice to see you again. Last time we saw each other, we weren't locked down and we were a little more free. You know, I need to say at the beginning, and I don't say this enough, partly because of my own ego, but I really don't regard myself as a scholar. I became a teacher. That's what I really wanted to do. I wanted to teach. And it's still my passion as a priest to teach. And even writing books for me is something I greatly enjoy. It's not a burden, so that I write with pleasure, and it's you know, it's the way a painter paints or a pianist plays. It's the way I express myself. And I happen to have a great interest in Shia history, especially around Karbala. And so I wrote my first book on Lady Fatima because, as I've said often enough, I was horrified that there was so little written about this woman, who is the last surviving daughter of the Prophet of Islam, and nobody had written anything about it. So I decided to write that, and then followed that up with a book on Zainab, really partly as a slight joke in the faculty. We all agreed that the Muslim scholars were not writing enough about the women, so we'd each write about a woman, the four of us here. But the other three were joking, and I took it seriously, and I actually then published a book which surprised everybody because none of them had done anything. And the recent book on the dreams about Karbala were little bits of hadith and history that I collected from the text as I went along and just put into a special file and then put them all together. So I delight in researching and reading and studying, but most of all in teaching. And that's really why I've followed this path, in order to teach others, especially Christians, to be able to stand reverently before the faith of another person, and reverently before, yes, their sacred sites and the things that they hold holy. For me, that's a very important dialogue. Besides interreligious, intra-religious is, for me, equally important.
Thank you. Dr. Chris Hewer, may I ask you what has brought your book about understanding Islam? Why did you think this was important to publish?
First of all, we have to say, why does a Christian spend years of their life studying about Islam and seeking to know and to understand it as well as they can? And my answer to that is, because I fear God. Because on the day of judgment, when God says to me, when I sent another one of my faithful communities and their members to live alongside you, what made you so arrogant to think that I couldn't teach you, a Christian, something about my ways, the ways of God, through this other faith community, through what I had done in their lives? So for me, this whole work is an act of faith, an act of ibadah. It is an act of the worship of God, a duty that I owe to God. Now, if I take that seriously, then as a teacher, I need to help others to enter into that same relationship. And so therefore, my work is about helping others to grow into an understanding of Islam. So I'm engaged in what we call adult popular education. That means any adult person from 16 to 101, my oldest student was 101 and she had her birthday during the course, of any background, of any educational status, to help them to enter into and to understand about Islam. And why? Again, I come back to one of the 10 commandments given to Moses, which says, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Now, if we are honest about the history of Christian-Muslim relations, a great deal of the time has been spent in bearing false witness. That is, in half-truths, untruths, distortions, and positive lies about the other in order to destabilize and to undermine their faith and their relationship with God. That's part of our history that I want to stand against. We call that polemics. But also another part of our history has been proving why my faith is better than yours. And so it's in that argument which has constantly got to have you going down and me going up. And these two ways I want to leave behind in my work. I need to help people to enter into the paradigm of Islam so that they can understand it as Muslims understand it. So I'm very happy to say that my first teachers, and throughout the last 35 years, most of my teachers have been Muslims. And I have sought to learn from them the inside understanding of Islam as Muslims live and teach it. This is the essence of my work, and that's the reason for this book that you have shown. It's called not just Understanding Islam, but the subtitle is The First 10 Steps. And it became the textbook for a course that I taught over 10 weeks to thousands of people, many of whom were Christians, others of no faith, others of other faiths, and many young Muslims would come in order that they could begin to understand their faith in a language and in a pedagogical style that they could understand. So this is the essence of my work, not to allow people to bear false witness, but also let me end with one other profound thought. On the day of judgment, I rather hope, I trust, that God will put the best possible construction, the best possible understanding upon my life, will look for the good and not dwell on the bad. And if I hope in that way that God will judge me by God's mercy and not by God's judgment, then I also need to seek out and to present the best understanding of Islam, because that's the way I would want me to be treated. That's the way I would want my faith to be understood by Muslims. And also, therefore, I need to counter that current trend, which is constantly to seek out the worst and to present that as though that were Islam.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to now move on to the recent Pope Francis's visit to Iraq, and I'm sure that you will have some interesting insights to this, and we'll perhaps draw upon three elements that you could bring out. Firstly, the importance of strengthening the local Christian communities, and especially all those who are persecuted by ISIL. And then we'll talk about the multi-faith event at Ur and the importance of the Abrahamic link. And of course, the visit of the Pope to the Grand Ayatollah Sistani. Yeah, so Father Christopher, I know you had watched the visit and had given lots of interviews about it. Would you like to just comment on those three elements, please?
I will with pleasure, but I could chatter on now for an hour about this because there's lots to say. So just stop me, because both Dr. Chris Hewer and I are both Christian theologians, and for me, the Pope, in a sense, was not there as a Catholic leader, but as a Christian theologian and a man of Christian spirituality, and therefore represented a whole lot of other people. I think, firstly, that in years to come, when we write a biography of this Pope, the Iraqi visit will be the highlight of his papacy. I don't think he has done or will do anything else that comes close to this moment in terms of its symbolic importance, because it doesn't actually matter, for example, what he and the Grand Ayatollah may have said to each other. It was the sight of two men of faith and men of prayer together at peace in the home of one of them, the very humble home of one of them. Just that alone was enough. And the Pope made it clear that he was going to Iraq as a pilgrim, not as a political or religious leader, but as a simple pilgrim. And I hope that eventually somebody from Najaf would be able to organize a return visit and say, well, we're going to come and visit you now. It would just be a great thing. So from the symbolic point of view, I think it was beyond anything that you and I can actually fully understand at this moment. I think that the Pope was quite clearly, having met 2 years ago with what we could call the representatives of Sunni Islam in Abu Dhabi, I think he was coming full circle. He was enclosing this embrace he is making of the Islamic world, in which he will not allow sectarianism to put him off. And he was saying the whole of Islam is important to me as a Christian leader, not just one part of it. I also think, of course, it was very important for local Christians and Muslims who have suffered horrendously in Iraq over countless years now. It's been decades of suffering. For ordinary people to see him was a very important thing, and he certainly spoke to the Christians and encouraged them in their difficulties. He also, by visiting reminded us of the importance of Abraham. In the Abraham-Ibrahim tradition, the truth is that as theologians, we don't know that much about Abraham. He's quite a shadowy figure, a great deal of his background, but he nonetheless stands for something important, and that is the belief we have in one God and one God alone. This is what Abraham reminds us of the faith that we put in this one God. So that was equally important. And there's a great deal more, but I suspect that I have a great respect for the Ayatollah. I think that he is deeply and profoundly respected both in and outside of Iraq by all kinds of people, not just by one particular group of Shia Muslims. And I think that his own humility, his profound humility in that moment, and he radiates, as the Pope himself said, that he's a man of God. He radiates a real sense of God's presence as well as all his learning. I think you had two men, both of whom have understood that we have to make peace and live in peace, because otherwise the world doesn't have a chance of a future. And you have two men who are both on the same mindset, that if you want peace, you have to create justice in society, otherwise peace will never come. And I think it was for me, it justified and gave value to all of the years I spent trying to build up relationships. It just in one instant did that for me. And it was a wonderful moment.
Amazing. Thank you. Absolutely. Very, very enriching. Dr. Chris Hewer, what would you like to discuss about Pope Francis' visit to Iraq?
I just want to add one or two things to what Christopher has said. First of all, there is something profoundly important about the Christian message that says we stand with those who are oppressed, with those who are marginalized, with those who are on the outcast within society. And it doesn't matter who they are, as long as they are human beings, they are therefore profoundly important to us. And for me, that was a hugely important part of that visit. Secondly, I think not only does Abraham stand for the oneness of God, but he stands also for the rejection of idols. Not just the idols of his father's factory, of his father's shop, but all our modern day idols of nationalism, of racism, of respect for wealth, of the worship of all our modern isms. And he also represents for us profoundly the life of faith. He is not asked, you are to believe in me. He is asked, get up and go where I will take you. And so the life of faith is not about profession of belief, it is about putting it into action. And I just want to go back and emphasize one of the things that Christopher said about that image that we had of the Pope and Ayatollah Sistani together. Because we know one or two very small things about their nearly hour-long discussion. And that is very important to me. In our modern world, we think that we have a right to know everything that everybody is thinking, let alone talking about. And here we have two profound men of God in private conversation with the third being present. And the third is, of course, the presence of God. And that is a profound element of that visit too.
Could I add one thing based on something that Chris said, because I think it is a crucial point, and that is the question of the faith of Abraham, that faith is not a creed or an aqidah that we recite. It's an orientation. It's a way that people walk through life. And Abraham, for me, is the model of that, not the creed reciting faith, but a faith that is getting up and moving forward at God's word. It's a way of walking. And I think that whether one is Islam or Muslim or Jewish or Christian, that's what faith is, primarily. It's a way of walking through this life with God under his reign and under his companionship. So I think that's a very beautiful point.
And I'd like to come back with one more point, if I may. And that is that we forget today the hugely important part that Iraq has played within the life of all these faith communities. There have been Christians in Iraq since the very beginning. Jews were in Iraq for 2,600 years. If we went back to 1930, Baghdad was the great center of Southern Arab Jewry. And then, of course, Muslims have been in Iraq since very shortly after the time of the Prophet. And these three faiths have lived together in this territory, together with Yazidis, with Mandeans, with Zoroastrians, and so on. And we saw all these represented at Ur. And so we must never lose sight of the fact that we have a long and profound tradition of living alongside one another, sharing in one another's feasts, in one another's joys and sorrows, and respecting one another's faith, the faith in the one God and the faith in the different expressions that one God calls us to. So Iraq is hugely important in this multi-faith dimension.
Absolutely, yes. Just to bring about a point, at the Khoei Foundation 3 years ago, we had Jews and Muslims together had built a sukkah outside, and one of the Jewish members from the neighboring synagogue who came from Iraq, and he said that in Iraq we used to enjoy our celebrations and our sad occasions, and he missed that. So it really does reflect what you've just said, Chris, as to how people lived together in peace and harmony for centuries. Yeah. So if I could perhaps move on to talk about the importance of sacred sites with the situation in Iraq and how they play a very important part in the lives of faith communities. Father Christopher, if I could perhaps ask you to
so perhaps we could begin this by reminding ourselves that God is a God of revelation. In other words, God reaches people through people, in other words, the prophets that he has sent. That's how God reaches us. His word doesn't simply float down out of the air. It's brought to us by prophets, by people. But God also reaches people through places. In the same way that a piece of music or a beautiful picture might raise your heart or your mind to God, there are places that do that also. And each religious family has places that are important, either historically, because something happened there. I'm thinking of the Kaaba, for example, or spiritually, because people had an experience of God there and keep going back, the bush of Moses, the burning bush of Moses, for example. Or for each of us, places where we stopped and prayed, or where God made his presence felt, or where God used something or someone to remind us of the things that matter. So within religious families, God, who is not bound by temples and masjids and synagogues, he is free. God can, and I think this was what he was trying to say right throughout the history of Revelation, that I am not locked in one place. Nonetheless, God is free to make himself present to people in a particular place of his choosing. But more especially, in every culture, I don't think there's a single culture in the world that doesn't honor its dead in some way. And we do it in different ways. You can go into the middle of a modern secular city like London, and you'll see people tending the graves of their loved one in all the great cemeteries, because that's what we do. The people we love, we let them go when they go back to God, but we find ways of keeping something of their memory because we're not heartless. In the same way that I might have a photograph, I might go and tend the grave of someone I love. Now, that's not a religious thing necessarily. Non-religious people equally go to the graves and burial sites of their loved one. And if you trace this through cultural history rather than religious history, burial places as sacred sites have always been part of who we are as human beings. We may do it in different ways, but we do it nonetheless. Now, there, in the book that I wrote about the dreams of Karbala, there are a number of interesting hadith one of which is the Prophet in the house either of Lady Fatima or maybe Ayman, and they're eating a meal. And in the course of the meal, the predictions of Al-Hussein's martyrdom come up. And Al-Hussein, who's still a little boy, turns to his grandfather and says, when we are dead, will people come and visit us? Or will we be alone? Because the Prophet has told them their graves are going to be somewhat scattered. They're not always going to be in the same place. And young Hussein is somewhat frightened by this, perhaps, and he says, but will people come? And the Prophet says, there are faithful members of my ummah who will come and who will visit. The Prophet himself, and I'll finish on this point, the Prophet himself, in these encounters he has with Jibreel, who is coming to predict the death of Al-Hussein, mostly in the house of Salama, the Prophet himself becomes quite bold. At the beginning, it's only Jibreel who talks and the Prophet listens. But as the texts develop, the Prophet begins to question and he says, show me where. I want to see the place where he lies. In other words, not just the battlefield, but the place where the body of his grandson will be. So, you know, we also have traditions of the Prophet going and weeping at graves, Hamza and some of his own daughters who predeceased him. So grave sites are like churches or monasteries or synagogues or masajid. They are of crucial importance to people and form part not just of our religion, but of our psyche, our national psyche. And to damage that is to damage the whole national psyche of a population.
Absolutely. Thank you. Dr. Chris Hewer, if I could address you about the importance of sacred sites, burial sites especially.
Well, that was a very profound contribution that we heard. Let's emphasize one of those points. You see, the philosophers will tell us quite rightly that God is, of course, beyond time and beyond space. So God is not located anywhere. God is not to be found in any particular time. But what that means is that those who have died also are beyond time and beyond space. So we say they have entered into another dimension. But one of our tasks, why do we repeat festivals and commemorations year after year after year? It is because we are seeking as earthly believers locked in time and space to actually enter into that perspective of God. And we call this a kind of meta-history beyond the historical time and space in which we live. So for God, everything is present right now. That's why on the day of Ashura, we will say, we are there with Hussein now on the field of Karbala. And what we're saying is we are entering into that other dimension, the dimension of God. Now, in this way, then, we can talk not about a physical closeness, but rather about a spiritual closeness. And that is what we major on when we go to visit any sacred place. Because God is not there in some way that God is not everywhere, but in that place we can draw a spiritual closeness, both to God and to those who have gone before us, which transcends that time and space in which we now live. So I remember someone saying to me, I wanted to go home and to tell my partner who had died about something that I had just learned. And then it dawned on me that actually they already knew. Because those who have died are closer to me now in spirit than they could ever be in our physical bodily form. And so it is this spiritual proximity, this spiritual closeness that we major on when we talk about spiritual sites. Now, philosophers, believe it or not, are also human beings. They also have hearts. And therefore, in their hearts, they know that by going to a certain place, by experiencing a certain aura, a certain atmosphere, a certain cultural perspective, as Christopher put it, that their heart is lifted and is taken up into that spiritual embrace. I have never yet met a single Muslim who, on their first visit to the sacred mosque in Mecca, has not been awestruck by their first encounter with the Kaaba. Throughout my whole life, I have been turning toward the Kaaba in prayer, but now here it is before my very eyes. My heart, my soul, my whole being is lifted into a new spiritual relationship. And that's what we're talking about. Now, God works through human beings. They are our human role models. How do we know that the teaching of the Quran is possible for a human being to live and to put into practice? Only because of the life of the Prophet. Only because of the lives of those pious and holy ones that went before us. Without them, we are just empty gongs. We are nothing. We need these spiritual role models. That's why we have our human forebearers, as it were. Now, a crucially important thing about all our great religious leaders is that they do not belong to us. They do not belong to any particular faith tradition. They belong rather to God. And if they belong to God, then they belong to all humankind. That's why when we enter into a sacred site of another faith tradition, we are at home and we are not guests, because we are human beings. And God is speaking to us as human beings in and through the role model of that person with whom this place is associated. And the thing about buildings is that somehow they seem to absorb the prayers, the devotions, the reverence, the respect that has been poured out in them for centuries. So I remember when I visited Amritsar, and there was the Golden Temple with the pool around it, and the prayers of generations and generations, the recitation of Guru Granth Sahib somehow has entered into the very stones, so that when it had to be repaired some decades ago, the stones that were taken away, that had to be discarded, were buried in the courtyard of another Gurdwara, because the very stones had become sacred. They had become, as it were, living receptacles of the prayers that had been recited over them. So our buildings are, in this sense, sacred in their very fabric. And just as in the same way, when I had the pleasure of going to Karbala, to Najaf, and seeing there the shrines of the Imams, one can feel and experience that spiritual closeness, which is the whole purpose of these sites. They are not just to take us back in our memory, as it were, to, this is where this happened, this is where that happened, but they are to take us into a much more profound level of memory, which we would call making present. So the great act is made present here and now, in this time, in this place, through our spiritual communion with God. And that's why these sacred places are so important.
You have to.
Aliya, you're muted.
Oh, sorry, yes. I wish we could talk more at length about your visit to Iraq and this importance. And in traditional cosmology and metaphysics, we see this multiplicity that governs the outward world of appearances, and we see unity in this multiplicity. So if I just bring my final question now, what message do you have for world citizens, especially UNESCO, to preserve the sacred sites and restore demolished sites such as the mausoleums of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family members in Jannatul Baqee and Jannatul Mawalla cemeteries in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia? Father.
Okay. So I mean, everything that has been said, everything that Chris said about these places being collecting points, if you like, for the prayers and the tears of countless generations. And this is crucial. This is what makes a church or a masjid holy, that people pray there and it becomes a place that is, if you like, anointed by those prayers. I've never understood why people destroy things. Maybe I'm a bit simplistic in my worldview, but I've never understood why people break laws and rules. I've never understood that. And I've never understood why people break things down. And I've lived in Western countries where I see it in other ways, when I see teenagers covering beautiful places with graffiti, and it's a form of distraction. Here in Rome, where we have some very beautiful, very ancient artwork outside, often on buildings, some of it has been defaced by graffiti. You know, pictures that were put up in the 1500s and the 1400s, just defaced forever and impossible. So that's on a much smaller scale. I've never understood why there is in humanity this destructive streak. We destroy buildings and places and memories and things. We hold on to bad memories and we let good memories go. I don't know why we do that, but that's what we do. So that's already for me a great issue, that as long as we don't find peaceful ways of coexistence in the world, destruction, whether it's through warfare or through deliberate maleficence and ill will, is going to continue. We have to find a way. Perhaps we have to find a way, and I don't know how we do this, but to reintroduce to people respect for God and respect for people, for things. Maybe it's something we've lost. Even if people don't want to respect God, you know, at least respect other human beings, respect their dignity, their needs, their memories, their tears and their suffering. There's that famous philosophy, which I suppose really comes probably from Asia, that, you know, always try to help people, but if you can't help them, don't hurt them any more than they've been hurt already. So obviously I would love to see and urge anyone who can to rebuild some of these places that have been destroyed or covered over, for the sake of the people for whom those places are precious, for the sake of the people whose ethic or whose spirituality or whose morality, whose relationship with God and with their family is built up around those places. But also to encourage respect in the world for things, respect for places. Millions of tourists come to Rome, you know, to see old buildings. It's not enough to look at them on the internet. They want to see them. It's not enough to see a Caravaggio or the Sistine Chapel online. They actually want to see them, because being in these places means something to them. And Chris has said this better than I can say it. It means, so why should it not be the same for people in Saudi Arabia or Iraq? Why is it different in Rome or in London or in New York and not the same there? It's exactly the same. There was that famous parliamentarian in England who got up before the war, the attack, the entry into Iraq, and he said, "Do you think Arab women don't suffer as much as Western women? Do you really think they don't weep for their children?" It was the most powerful speech. And I would say the same about places. Millions of people come to Europe as pilgrims and as tourists to see places in reality and pictures and art. And why should it be any different for places that are precious to other cultures? Why should we treat them as less important? So I would hope that there would be some parity in this, in terms of the restoration that we see in the world for these places.
Yes, definitely. We hope and pray that this will become a realization in the near future. Dr. Chris Hewer, what would you like to say as a message for UNESCO?
I think I would like to start with the Masjid al-Nabi. with the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina, because that mosque over centuries has been expanded, has been made more and more beautiful by generations, and the tomb of the Prophet has been made a beautiful shrine. Now, what is a shrine? A shrine is a place where people worship God. We need to say that very loudly, so I'll say it again. A shrine is a place where people worship God, but they gather in that place in order to take example from the person who is buried there. But also, those who have died are not inert, they are not inactive. They are capable also of lending their prayers to ours in bringing our prayers before God. So we are worshiping God, but we are remembering those very holy people whose shrine, before whose shrine we stand. Now, in that way, then, we can think of the shrines that were at Al-Baqee, and over the many centuries, there have been different buildings, different shrines, different mausolea there. They were put up by believers as a sign of their respect for those who were buried there. So, as it were, they were tangible, visible prayers to God, to say, this person who was buried here was precious in your sight. They were a devoted worshipper of you. We also would like to follow their example. And here is a tangible sign of our worship and of our prayer. And so that's why these shrines are made beautiful, for the worship of God and out of respect for those who are buried there. Obviously, for all Muslims, how can we possibly think of dividing one Muslim from another? Those who profess the faith in one God and in the prophethood of Muhammad all stand equally before God and before the Prophet himself. All of them, and that obviously includes both men and women. So therefore, both men and women and all Muslims must have access to these sacred places, which are made beautiful and which respect is shown. If you go to the most humble village graveyard, you will find that over centuries, people have built a wall around it to keep animals out, that they have built pathways so that people can pass between the graves. They have shown it reverence and respect and love in this way, and therefore to see something destroyed so that it almost looks like this is the rubble that was left is a profound state of disrespect. Not just disrespect to those who are buried there, not just disrespect to those who go there on pilgrimage in order to worship God, but also disrespect to God, whose servants they were, whose beloved they were. How then can we not show our respect for God by replacing and beautifying these sacred sites?
Indeed. And, you know, Baqee is an organization that campaigns to rebuild the shrines in Medina, and to immediately to cease the destruction of these holy spaces and items, and to rebuild them to their original beauty. And as you've both mentioned so eloquently, these sites and the communities around them are important. Their preservation doesn't just preserve cultural and religious history, it maintains peace in the world today. And so whilst there is UN machinery to protect world sites of heritage as mandated by UNESCO, the world must pay more attention to the preservation and the protection of spiritual and holy places. May I convey sincere, heartfelt gratitude to both of you, Father Christopher Clohessy and Dr. Chris Hewer, It has been an immense joy and an honor for us to be able to talk to you. And we do hope we can talk again in the future about this very important issue in the lives of the Muslims today, about these very important heritage sites. Thank you so much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. God bless.
God bless
Thanks,
you.
Chris.
Al-Baqee, Al-Baqee! Al-Baqee, Al-Baqee!